So let me welcome today's speaker, Tom Beeks, who's a trainer at the Bell Foundation. I think many of you will already know Tom, but for those who don't, Tom has worked in English language teaching since 2003. He has taught around the world and is particularly interested in international education and teacher development. You may also know that Tom helped create the Bell Foundation's Language for Results International suite of online training courses, and he also works as an assessor for the Bell Foundation's ALFRE accreditation scheme. And in today's webinar, Tom will explore how to use barrier games to support multilingual learners to better access the curriculum. If there is time at the end, Tom will take any questions that you may have. So feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to send any questions as they come to you during the webinar, and I will collect them and post them to Tom at the end. And then in a couple of days, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as links to any resources that Tom will be mentioning today. But now it's time to pass over to Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Shaka, and hello and a very warm welcome to everybody. It's great to see so many people joining us from around the world, and great to see some familiar names. But also, if you're new to the Bell Foundation and it's your first time joining us for a webinar, welcome. So let's get straight in there. Today, we are going to be talking all about barrier games. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read what we're doing. So hopefully by the end of the webinar today, you'll feel more confident creating and using barrier games with your learners to practice and develop curricular related language, but also develop general communication skills. It's a great opportunity to share ideas as well. So please, if you have any experiences of your own to share in the chat as we go through, please do. Okay, so we're going to begin by just thinking about what we mean when we say barrier game. Okay, so I'll throw it over to you first of all. What is a barrier game? What type your ideas in the chat for what you kind of think of when you hear this term. It may be that you have no idea, in which case fine, but I'm sure many of you have used barrier games before. So throw some examples or descriptions of what you do in the chat. Okay. So we've got things like information gap activity, student A, student B, supporting speaking, developing communication skills. Okay, there's some very good responses, creating dialogue. Okay, so lots of interesting ideas coming through. And essentially, I'm going to give you kind of my understanding of a barrier game. Not to say that it's the only way we can think about it, but when I'm talking about a barrier game, I'm talking about a type of information gap activity. So that means each person involved has different information, which the other person needs. And of course, the reason it's called a barrier game is that we usually create a physical barrier so that the participants cannot see each other's information. And therefore, the information must be communicated orally in order to complete the task. So in this case, the example on the screen, the task is to complete missing information so that both participants end up with the same information. But there are other variations as well that we'll come on to. Barrier games can be played by two learners, two pairs of learners, an adult, and a learner, or a group of learners, or even two groups of learners. And we'll talk more about specific examples later in the webinar. But I also want to talk about why it's important or useful to use barrier games, especially with, excuse me, learners who use EAL. And I think the first reason is that it's an opportunity for purposeful communication. It provides a clear reason and motivation for using key language in the classroom context. Secondly, barrier games support language development by developing strategies for successful communication. And this can be developing functional language skills, for example, the ability to reword or request clarification or ask questions, explain, clarify, describe. But it also could be social, for example, negotiating communication breakdowns or cooperating successfully with somebody else and understanding somebody else's point of view and so on. Barrier games can also really help with independent learning skills because they develop learners' metacognition. So that's their understanding of how they learn and how much they know. It helps them consider how much they might know about a particular topic or the content that you're studying, because it often involves them giving information to another person from their own memory. But it also helps them reflect on what aspects of English might be causing them difficulties and where they might need to improve. So where there are sort of gaps in their communication skills as well. And finally, linked to the first point here, barrier games are genuinely motivating and provide a sense of achievement for learners. And this is because these tasks often position the learner as the expert rather than the teacher, which is inherently motivating for a lot of children. And also there's often a problem-solving element to barrier games, which again can be very motivating and engaging for learners. In terms of thinking about when we might use barrier games, I mean, I've used them all my career really in all kinds of different contexts, and that's because they're so flexible. So you might want to use barrier games to introduce new content, especially subject content. Barrier games can be a good way for learners to share with each other new information rather than it coming from the mouth of the teacher. I think when we're doing them in the context where we've got learners using EAL, we need to make sure that if we're introducing new content, there isn't also lots and lots of new vocabulary at the same time, because we don't want to overwhelm them with both new language and content as well. But potentially they can be used to introduce content. They could also be used to support development of particular specific language features. So for example, if our learners are struggling with making questions in English, we could design a barrier game that involves asking lots of questions, because that's going to help them improve the use of their use of questions and using the correct word order and things like that. I think probably many of us use barrier games to review content as well, to review both language and content. And lastly, they provide opportunities for learners to repeatedly encounter and use key terms and key vocabulary related to the topic being studied. And as we know, for learners using EAL, this is absolutely critical. It's giving them that extra exposure, that extra practice at using the language which they need to develop their skills. Okay, let's get a little bit more practical then and look at some examples of different types of barrier games. So again, I'm going to throw it over to you first of all. In the chat, share your ideas. So what types of barrier games do you use with your students, if you use them? And in what types of topics or subject areas do you use them? If you're an EAL specialist, you might want to talk about maybe what language areas you use them to develop as well. But if you want to write your ideas. Okay, so Things like prepositions coming up already. Okay. Absolutely. Giving directions. Okay, using maps. It's interesting. Directional language. Okay, back to the board, people saying. It's interesting what's coming up here is lots, for me, is that what's coming up are a lot of sort of language focused activities. And we're talking about language rather than subject and topic content. So it's absolutely brilliant that you're thinking of it in terms of language, but I think also in a international school context in particular, it's really important to think about how we can link the language to the curricular content as well. And we'll look at some examples for that as we're going on. But yeah, thank you for sharing. There's some really excellent ideas there. I'm going to give you a sort of list that I put together. This is by no means exhaustive, but as you can see, there's a really wide array of different types of possible barrier games. So I'm going to take each of these types and provide some examples. Some of these types might work better with primary learners, others with secondary, but I think most of them can be adapted to work with both. And I'll be using examples from both primary and secondary stages. And as I go along, please feel free to add your own examples and ideas in the chat so that we can build up together a richer repertoire of barrier games that we can use to support our learners. Okay, so perhaps the most common or widely known barrier game are the sort of fill the gaps type barrier games. So this is where each partner has a different text with gaps. Now these gaps could be in texts, like on the screen now, but they could also be maps or charts, diagrams, timelines, essentially anything where there are words or numbers providing information. And this is where we can link our barrier games to the curricular content in a really powerful and useful way. So here's an example from a maths resource that you can find on our website. It's to help teach place values. So the children work in pairs and each child is given a table like this. One child has the number information, the other child has the place value information, and they have to ask each other questions to find the missing information and complete the table. Notice how this task is developing both content and language. So we're solidifying their understanding of place values, which is the content, but we're also giving them practice at correctly saying and pronouncing long and complex numbers as well, which is obviously a very useful skill to have in the classroom and, in fact, in life as well. Here's a similar example taken from a chemistry lesson. And this time it's based on the periodic table. So if you squint, they're quite small, but you can see here that the gaps in the table relate to the different characteristics of the elements that appear in the periodic table. So it allows students to familiarize themselves with the structure and organization of the table, as well as producing and hearing the names of the elements. So there's quite a lot of rich topic-based language involved here, as well as the exchange of information and asking and answering questions. Here's an example from a history lesson. In this case, it's a history lesson based on the Black Death. And in this barrier game, each student has the same map, but with different dates to show how the disease spread across Europe. By asking questions, they can complete the map with the full information. And you can see here that for this activity, we provide them with examples of questions and models of answers as well. And of course, this map could then be kept by the student and referred to in future tasks and kept as a revision tool. So it's essentially just another way of presenting important information, but in an engaging way that's also developing language and is more likely to help students engage with the content and understand it. And these kind of fill in the gap activities, I think, are really useful because they require speaking, listening, writing, and reading skills. And they're a great way to provide opportunities for language practice and to consolidate key content information as well. The examples you've just looked at, of course, are sort of focused around secondary level, but I'm going to look at a type of barrier game that we might want to use more with primary learners or even early years. And this is the simple kind of ask and retrieve kind of barrier game. And in this type of game, it involves one partner asking for something using a description and the other partner providing the correct object or the correct picture. So this example here is taken from our Jack and the Beanstalk resource. And you'll see that to play, the children need flashcards of the key vocabulary from the text. And then there are question cards for each item of vocabulary. And they're things like this. Can you give me something that Jack climbed up? So each player or each partner has a pile of question cards, and they also have the pictures as well spread out in front of them. And then they simply take turns turning over a question card, and then the other partner must give them the object being described. So it's very simple. And the barrier here is simply that, you know, the children don't have the actual words, the vocabulary, so they have to remember it. So it works well as a vocabulary retrieval exercise, as well as developing skills such as describing and paraphrasing things you don't have a word for. So it's kind of, again, subtly integrating other language skills alongside the main content, which is just helping them remember the vocabulary from the story. Another type, I think a few of you already mentioned this and earlier, is describe and draw, or you might call it a drawing dictation as well. And I love this kind of barrier game because it's so flexible. And essentially, it's where one person creates an image or has a finished image and then describes it to their partner, who has to recreate it, has to draw it. However, at the simplest level, if we think about the younger age groups, this could be a coloring in activity to reinforce key vocabulary. So children might have the same coloring sheet with the key vocabulary items. So we've got like transport vocabulary here, for example, and they take turns asking their partner what to color in. And then by doing that, they take turns asking their partner what color something is, and then listen to the response and copy it. And then the aim is that they end up with the same colors on their sheets, and they can compare at the end if they've done it correctly. Of course, this can be extended to more sophisticated things as the students get older. So if we take a topic like history or the Romans, they could, for example, describe an existing picture and the other student has to draw it. Again, they'll be using lots and lots of topic-specific vocabulary to do this. My soldier has a red crest, has a helmet, a shield. But actually, I like to adapt this as well, especially if you've got quite artistic or creative students. It can be more fun to let the students draw their own soldier or whatever character it is that you're working on, and then dictate that. And of course, that can be a little bit more kind of creative. And again, the key thing here is that we're not worried about historical accuracy of this activity. It's about reusing the key vocabulary and just rehearsing and practicing that. And to support this, to make sure they are using the vocabulary you might want to give them a list of things to include in their drawing to ensure that the key vocabulary is getting used. So they need to make sure it includes the things on the list, and then they can dictate it to their partner. And then, of course, they can have a lot of fun when they compare their answers at the end. Another version of this that I've found really useful, and I think some of you mentioned already as well, is to describe and draw using a scene or a map. And this is a variation that, again, brings in lots of useful language around describing locations and places. And is particularly applicable to things like history and geography. So again, I'm using a Roman example here. And I just found this image because it's a nice illustration, but obviously in reality, you could do something very, very simple. The students could create their own. It doesn't have to be a work of art. It's all about that, using the language. It's not about doing perfect drawings. And just to illustrate how language rich this activity is for developing basic academic language skills, as well as topic vocabulary, or the tier 3 vocabulary, some of you might know it as, is these kind of drawing dictations are wonderful for prepositions of place. I think people have already mentioned. They're great for using things like the present continuous for describing what's happening at the moment. He is, walking, playing, she is swimming, whatever it might be. They're excellent for building use of adjectives: big, long, straight, tall, and comparatives. So the giant is taller than the man. We can also use them for things like ordinals, first, second, and third, and the kind of sequencing language that is very common in academic contexts as well, for when they're doing their dictations. So as you can see, they're just brilliant ways of bringing in lots of language as well as content stuff as well. And it's important to know that not all students are very artistically inclined. So a way of making describe and draw a bit less artistic could be to turn it into describe and make. And one of the ways that I've seen this done really successfully is making pictures with shapes, or with 2D cutouts of shapes. So by creating pictures connected to the curricular content with shapes, you're going to reinforce the curricular vocabulary, and of course their shape vocabulary as well, but also their general language skills. So this would be something like the first partner takes some geometric shapes of different colors and makes an image related to the topic being studied. So let's say it's animals. They could create a dog, or it's good for body parts. They can create their own like monsters, because then they've got like, all kinds of weird and wonderful body parts. But it can also work with places and environments and kind of anything really. And then of course the students dictate their creation to their partner, who has to then make it themselves. Or they could draw it as well, but if you don't have the resources. But I think it's often better if they have the physical shapes cut out. And obviously this could be adapted to make it work with 3D objects, things like blocks or origami, and that brings in a whole range of other language, such as verbs for instructions like fold, turn, rotate, and place. And the really important thing about these kind of activities is giving them time to compare at the end, partly because it's entertaining for the students to see, how they've managed to succeed or not succeed at copying what their partners told them, but also because this is really where they get to reflect on the language they were using and what they could have done better, or what they need to do better next time. And again, it's really important when you're doing these activities, it's not about getting it right or perfect. It's not about creating perfect works of art or anything like that. It's about manipulating and reusing the language over and over again. The shape dictation is another activity that I've done with older learners, and it's quite a powerful variation of what I've just described, where a student has to describe to their partner a geometric shape, and the partner simply has to draw it accurately. And this appears quite simple, but it requires, if you look at the example here, really quite complicated and sophisticated language to do it well. So it's a really great challenge for all learners, but it's particularly going to push learners using EAL to communicate more precisely, and expanding their range of language. And I think this activity is best used with secondary learners who've already got some communicative proficiency in English. And it's going to develop the kinds of describing language that can be applied really usefully to other contexts, like talking about graphs or 3D objects in subjects like design technology, or even in degree level subjects like engineering, because there's all kinds of useful academic language involved. Okay, so that's kind of the describe and draw barrier games. Another variation on the barrier game is arranging of sets. So this is where, again, we're using, rather than drawing or writing, we're using physical objects. And so children have to arrange physical objects to match their partner. And this could be, for example, using blocks, very simple level, and a child has to produce the same set as their partner by listening to the description. So they might give a description and then their partner has to recreate the same. And obviously this is something you could do with children who are not yet writing or reading very well at primary level, but it could easily be adapted to make it more complex for older children. And as well as language, is obviously at early years level also really useful for fine motor skills and spatial awareness. And it can be adapted for any types of object or crafts that the children regularly play with that you have available. So colored counters, threading jewelry, the kind of things that are commonplace in early years and sort of lower primary settings. And I think these kind of activities often work best with, or they can work very effectively with new to English learners as a teacher-led activity. So the teacher is the person giving the instructions and the children follow. Then as their language gets more sophisticated, they can potentially start doing it in pairs and partners as well. So of course, this kind of activity works well with things like Play-Doh, making models as well to build simple scenes to describe and arrange. And it also works really well with paper models. So children can make them as a craft activity first, the paper models, and then they can use them in some kind of barrier game. So paper dolls, for example, are perfect for practicing clothing and body parts. She is wearing, he is wearing, but they can be used with any kind of topic, as you can see. All right. Another type of barrier game, which you may be less familiar with, is the idea of completing a matching board or a grid. So again, the idea is the same as the previous ones. You want the two partners involved to end up with the same matching board. So you start with a board or grid, and you have some flashcards of the key vocabulary for each player. And this example here comes from a barrier game to familiarize students with the characters from Hamlet. And you can see that the grid is already scaffolded by having descriptions on each square. So it says, the top square on the left, the middle square on the right, and so on. And one partner places a choice of flashcards on their grid, and the other person has to recreate the grid by asking questions and then listening to the description. So again, they're giving clues rather than saying the actual name. Usually is a way of making this more complicated. You have to instruct the students not to use the actual names of the characters. They have to describe them by another way. And afterwards, they can remove the barrier and check they have the same grid. Now, for a version of this activity more suited to primary level, you could use something simple like a word grid. This is going to help children practice word recognition of both the spoken and written forms of key vocabulary. So with a word grid, you might just want to use something like color counters. So the first part, child A can put the counters on their word card, and then they have to tell their partner where to put the counters in order to create a matching grid. So it's the same activity, but sort of simplified variation. And again, we can adapt this further for children who perhaps are not reading yet, or in the early stages of learning to read. And we can do the same activity essentially, but with a color grid. And this is less linguistically demanding because there's no requirement to read. And so this type of activity is also quite reusable, because once you've got your color grids, you can then laminate them and you can use them over and over again. And once the students get used to the activity, it's quite easy. So again, it's the same thing. One child has a set of vocabulary cards which they place on their grid, and then they describe them to their partner, who has to copy the grid, and hopefully they end up with the same thing. And again, once the students get used to this, it can be quite a quick and easy activity to set up. And it's a really great way to facilitate communication and just get them using that language over and over again in a sort of fun and engaging way. Okay. Another type of barrier game is the kind of can be used with just lists of vocabulary. So this is great because it doesn't really require any preparation or any sort of, illustrations or flashcards. And these kind of barrier games are a great way to review key content vocabulary and also to develop things like spelling and phonological awareness. So usually what you have here is two players have identical copies of key vocabulary. I've got some examples here from like a religious education lesson, for example. And the players take turns choosing a word from their list, and then they underline it in a color and they describe the word, again, without using the actual word, so that both partners end up with words underlined in the same color. And this can be used to the descriptions that the children use can be either language or content focused or a combination. And so the example here are sort of language focused clues. So they're talking about a word with 6 letters that begins with ch, or the word with 2 syllables. And obviously here the students are creating clues that relate to the sound or the spelling of the word. And of course, you could scaffold this by providing lists of clues to the students, or you could make it more challenging by asking them to think of the clues themselves before they begin the task. And again, it's all about at the end comparing your list to see if you've got the same and if they look the same. And in this particular way, you can really develop spelling and phonological awareness as well as reviewing key vocabulary. But of course, you can also make it more related to the content, and you can turn this into a kind of 20 questions game. Or some of you will know the backs to the board game that's very popular, isn't it? Where children have to describe, somebody has to describe an item. But this is more a version of the game 20 questions that I'm showing you here. So this is where you have to ask yes/no questions to guess something. So this could be a group task. One person has a word list and circles the word, and the rest of the group have to ask questions to discover what it is. And the person with the list can only answer yes or no. And if teams make an incorrect guess, they lose a life. And that, so you can give them, I don't know, 5, 10 lives, whatever you want. And that's just to stop them guessing really randomly what the words are, and being a bit more considered with their questions. And again, this is really low preparation. And once the teacher's modeled it a few times with the group, the students can do it by themselves in small groups. And then you're maximizing that participation of the students. And you can also adapt it for different proficiency levels or ability levels as well. So spot the difference activities can be a brilliant barrier game because they organically promote the use of lots of useful language. And in this kind of activity, then you're providing 2 scenes that include the target vocabulary, but are altered to include several differences. And the children work together to find the differences in their image. And they can either ask each other questions, or they could take turns giving a description. There's different ways of approaching it. And again, this can be very helpful for practicing new vocabulary, especially around topics like geography and prepositions of place or location as well. And it can be quite challenging to create your own materials here, but there are lots of pre-created materials, especially at primary level, which automatically have sort of spot the difference activities, which can be used as a simple barrier game as well. Continuing the map theme, then, we can also create a map grid to create a version of the very popular childhood game, Battleships. So this is where children draw their own island and add features from a list of vocabulary on the grid. So in this case, we're using geography as an example. So they might add the letters that correspond to the different geographical features. So O is an oxbow lake, for example. But of course, it doesn't have to be geographical features. It could be absolutely anything. It could be characters from a text you're studying, or or it could be kind of any vocabulary features really that could be placed on a map. If you want to make this more fun, you can also create a bad item, for example, like a bomb or a volcano or a scorpion, and the students add a set number of those onto their grid. And if a player finds an explosion or a volcano or whatever, they lose a life. And again, you can make it into a sort of more of a competitive, add a competitive twist to it. So if you're not familiar with Battleships, how this then works is students play by asking a question about a particular square on the grid. And the game is over when one player finds all the listed items or the other player loses all their life chances. And there's obviously lots of variations of that can be done as well. Okay. So that I've kind of bombarded you with loads of ideas, but I now want to sort of think a little bit more about the sort of technicalities of how we go about designing a barrier game and actually teaching it, because logistically they can be quite complex. But I do believe that they're worth the effort, because once students get used to them, they're really powerful tools for developing language, as well as helping them with all kinds of content knowledge as well. So the first step of the process, of course, is to select our text or our topic. And again, I'm sort of urging you to make this curriculum embedded if you possibly can, kind of make it, connect it to what the children are studying in their curriculum. So if you're an EAL specialist, this is where you need to be collaborating with the subject teachers to figure out how what language the students are going to need and will benefit from reviewing or developing. Then you're going to choose what language and what content you want your learners to develop. Now, this could be the same thing. For example, you could be reinforcing key vocabulary, so the language and the content are the same. But you might also want to introduce some language which is unrelated to the topic that you just want your students to improve or develop. So we talked before about things like question formation. So we've got vocabulary, could be asking questions. It could be things like using the past tense. And you might want to consider what other skills as well you want to develop, whether it's speaking, writing, listening. And of course, the beauty of barrier games is that they can involve all three. So, but you want to, thinking about carefully about the content and the language together is important. Then, of course, you can create kind of A and B resources for those sort of information gap type activities in particular. And the missing information should require learners to use the language and content that you've identified in step 2. So let's have a look at what that actually might look like in class. So here's a suggested process for how you might teach a barrier game. So first of all, obviously prepare the materials. So you have your partner A materials, your partner B materials, and obviously if you're working with learners using EAL, especially at the lower bands, you're probably going to want to provide some kind of scaffolding as well. So this means things like word mats and sentence frames, but it can also be done, ad hoc in the classroom, just on the board by eliciting from the students. And remember that any key language we want them to use should be pre-taught or they should already be familiar with. And also both A and B roles may need scaffolding, so they might need help both with asking questions, but also responding to the questions as well. Sometimes we forget and only provide the sort of questions, but we don't provide the answers as well. The next thing to do would be to model the activity, and obviously the teacher, the first time you do this, you might want to do it as a whole class activity with the teacher leading it, with the teacher playing the role of partner A and the students together being partner B until they get used to it. It's really important at this point as well to set the rules and the boundaries and to have clear rules and routines around these kind of speaking activities. So you might introduce things like speaking and listening courtesies, for example, asking, "Are you ready?" before you start the activity, and make sure your partner is listening. And if there are any rules around not saying certain words when describing, this is where you introduce those and make it really clear to the students what the rules are. And then, of course, the students do the activity. And I'm sure you've all experienced this, but barrier games can be quite chaotic. There's quite a lot of everyone's talking together, everyone's quite excited, they're quite fun, there's a lot of energy in the classroom. So do expect some chaos. And also, I find it useful just to take a little bit of a step back and observe and listen before you sort of jump in and start maybe supporting or helping students, especially if no one knows, especially if they don't know what to do, very obviously. Now, if nobody knows what to do in the whole class, you can always stop and model again. But don't be worried if it is a little bit chaotic the first time, because it just take them a little while to get the hang of it, especially if they're not used to doing this kind of activity. And then it's really important to build in, I think, this stage here, which is time to check and reflect. And this is where the learners compare their results. Okay. And this isn't just, haha, let's compare our funny, disastrous drawing that I've done based on the dictation. It's, as I mentioned before, this is where often the most important learning happens, because it can include kind of genuine communication around, well, what helped you to understand when you were doing the task with your partner? What would you do differently if you did this activity again? What language did you want to use, but you couldn't because you didn't have the words for it? And of course, if the students share a first language, or you share their first language, this kind of discussion can be done in the student's home language to kind of build that understanding and help you introduce language that next time is going to help them. And here is just some very practical tips around creating barriers. So, they're called a barrier game. Well, what could a barrier be? Well, I'm sure you've all got your own favorite techniques for this, but the simplest option is often, a clipboard, which they hold, which the other child can't see. Mini whiteboards can do the same thing, or even just an opaque piece of paper or card, or a textbook or a folder can act as a barrier, can't it? This is kind of the traditional method. If you're old school, you might have used a folded book or a card knotted with string, something like this, with some tips and prompts written on it. You can, of course, make a barrier by having students sit back to back. But I would be cautious about this technique, especially with sort of new to English learners, lower proficiency learners, because seeing someone's mouth and gestures is really going to support understanding. So perhaps this is probably better for more proficient learners. And with younger children as well, it's often just, it's very hard for them to not look at the person they're communicating with. So it tends to be better to sit them side by side and have some kind of barrier in between them, like that, and because it helps them to check more easily at the end as well, just from a sort of purely physical point of view, with the very small ones. You may also want to use backs as barriers. So in this version, children sit behind each other facing the same way, and you can actually pin, say, the scene or the picture to the child is describing to the back of one of the children, and then they dictate what's on the picture, and the child with the picture on the back has to draw what they're hearing from their partner, which again just adds a sort of slightly fun, more physical element to it. And of course, nowadays you have access to laptops and tablets, and they can work very well as well. They're easily hidden, you can turn them off, and many barrier game type activities obviously can work very successfully online because there's a natural physical barrier. But whatever you do, it's all about having a routine and sticking to it, and the students get used to the routine and the task setup. As they get used to it, it becomes a lot quicker and a lot more efficient. Okay, so we've talked a lot then about different kinds of barrier game and what makes some barrier games effective for certain types of language and skills, and what makes other barrier games better for others. So I'm just going to give you a quick sort of quiz here. I'm going to give you an example of two barrier games. The first barrier game here is a sort of gap fill. So partner A has a text with gaps. Partner B has the same text with different gaps, and they have to ask questions to fill in the gap. So the first partner A has Ahmed lives in blank. So partner A would ask partner B, where does Ahmed live, to get that information. So it's a simple question and answer kind of gap fill. And second example is a similar kind of gap fill. This time there's partner A, or it's a blue partner, and a red partner, partner B. This is obviously focused on geography in this case, and you can see that they've each got information with gaps and some prompts as well to help them. So in the chat box then, have a look and decide which of these barrier games you think is more effective and why. So yeah, give your reasons in the chat. I'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay, some really interesting responses coming in. Some people are sort of saying so, okay. So some people are saying it depends on what you're kind of using the activity for. And there's some people, interesting, some people are saying sort of A for EAL learners and B for content learners. Okay. So people think both depending on the goal. B has scaffolded questions. All right, yeah. There are some really good points being made here. And there is no real correct answer. Yeah, good question. How large is Africa be answered? Well, I think it can if you're thinking about it in terms of kind of first, second, third, like what, because I think that's what this task is. So it would be like Africa is the third largest continent or the second largest continent or something like that. I think that's what it's getting at. But yeah, I think you've all identified that there are sort of advantages and disadvantages with both. My suggestion would be that based on what we've been talking about, activity B is overall more effective in the sense that it's connected specifically to a curricular topic. And it's kind of well scaffolded. The example A, you're right, has the potential to be more useful because it has, I guess, it's allowing the students to be more free with the language they're using. It's, as I think somebody mentioned, it's harder because they have to come up with the questions on their own, but it's also not connected to any curricular topic. And if you look at the gaps, they're quite sort of random. So some of them are content like information, but some of them are sort of grammatical words. where I don't know what kind of question you would ask to do that. So it's not been very well designed from that point of view. The one thing I would say is that a couple of people, I think there was somebody mentioned that, you know, one is good for EAL learners and one is good for content learners. Well, to me, there is no distinction there. That's not a useful distinction, because EAL learners are content learners, right? That's why they're in school. Unless you are working, I guess, in a private language school context where you're only working in general English. But if we're working in a school context, there should not really be a distinction. All learners are both learning EAL and content at the same time, which is what I'm trying to get across by, we want to integrate the language with the content. There's no reason they can't be both. So if you have a language only exercise, all right, great. It's going to help them with question formation, but why can't we make that connected to the content as well, so that they're doing both things at the same time? But yeah, and I agree. I think Madeline's just put A could be too confusing, and it would be quite confusing. I think B is better scaffolded, but of course it depends on the level of our learners. But these are the kind of considerations we want to think about. If you're interested in resource B, that's taken from our website. Resource A was just one that I created to be a not a great example. It's not to say it couldn't be a good example, but the gaps I chose were not very well selected in this particular example. Okay, so to summarize then, an effective barrier game will provide a genuine need to communicate. It's going to be linked to the curriculum, even if your main focus is developing a particular language skill, such as asking questions or clarifying spellings. It's going to require learners to repeatedly use key language and particular structures. Hopefully, it also will require the use of some incidental social and functional language as well, such as, you know, asking for clarifications or paraphrasing or asking how to spell something. It should be well modeled and appropriately scaffolded, so students are provided with the language needed to succeed in the task, as well as the content knowledge. Ideally, we want it to be adaptable and also reusable and low preparation. So again, it's where we need to be a bit strategic about what we turn into a barrier game and what we don't. Okay, and just finally, I'm going to speak briefly about how we might adapt barrier games to work with different ability levels and different group types. So first way we can adapt barrier games is how we group and organize the students, and how we do this might depend on the language proficiency of the learners we're working with. So paired barrier games are the most common type, and they work best between players of similar language ability. We could also have like a buddy barrier game, which could help with younger children, or where you have mixed ability groups, because it allows pairings of a weaker and a more able language user to provide peer modeling and support. You might also have group barrier games, and they can be one individual working with many people, or two groups working together. So if it's one person working with many, this allows the teacher to model, perhaps, as we mentioned, and it helps the students get more confident with the activity before they move to doing it in smaller groups or pairs. And you can even do group-to-group barrier games. They can work if you have a room divider or some kind of physical screen, I guess, like a movable whiteboard in your classroom, but they can get a bit crazy and noisy. But it can be also a really great opportunity for group discussion, collaboration, learning how to work together. But they tend to work better, in my experience, with learners at sort of higher bands who can already kind of converse reasonably comfortably in English. Another type that we want to distinguish between is when we're adapting is whether to make them symmetrical or non-symmetrical. So with a symmetrical barrier game, this means both students involved take turns giving and receiving information in the same way. And this also means that both learners need to practice and use the same language structures and vocabulary. So it's at an equal level of linguistic challenge for each participant. Or they can be asymmetrical or non-symmetrical, so that one person is giving information and the other is receiving the information and maybe doing something with it. That might be something non-linguistic, like drawing or arranging or or moving things around. And so in this type of activity, one role tends to be more linguistically challenging than the other, although obviously it will depend on the task type. So those activities can be useful if you've got mixed ability groups and you want to sort of differentiate a little bit between different students. And I think it's important to recognize it's perfectly possible to successfully do barrier games with new to English learners. I love doing these with my beginner level learners, especially the really small ones. It's a great skill to kind of introduce them to. But it's really all about the scaffolding that we put in place, hence the image here. So as we've mentioned, modeling the game first with the whole group, doing it as an entire class activity first with the teacher in the describing role, and then moving to pairs and groups is going to be really useful. But less confident or less proficient learners, give them the more passive role first, so that they have the chance to hear someone else model the spoken part of the task. And you could even put a new to English learner in a group of 3, for example, so they can observe first before they take part. As we've mentioned, scaffolding language requirements on both sides of the exchange by providing prompts will be useful. And I think this idea of building complexity slowly, you could start with one structure, for example, one language structure. So if we're describing something, they could start by just saying, it is red, it is big, using it is adjective structure. Maybe the next time we could introduce a new structure, it is big, it can walk, it can't fly. Then we could add structures on top of that as they get more confident. It has 4 legs, it has got a trunk. So I mean, this is by gradually building it up each time, we're developing the language and we're allowing them to access it. And where possible, I think allowing for the use of shared languages where this could be useful. So again, I think I mentioned before, this is going to be helpful when we're talking about explaining the game or discussing the answers and reflecting on what went right or wrong. And you might also want to just allow the use of their home language for unknown words, so that you're not sort of blocking the basic conversation while they're doing it. And maybe you allow them to even play the game first in their home language, so that they can get used to the game and understand how it works. And then that can lead to a discussion about what phrases they used and how we can translate those into English. And again, that's obviously going to be more helpful where you share the language of your students, where it's a sort of bilingual context. Just here are some examples for how you might want to scaffold descriptions as well. So substitution tables are very much your friend here. If you don't use them already, I urge you to check out our webinar on substitution tables, a very, very helpful resource. And here's an example from a resource on the Tempest on Shakespeare about describing the characters with substitution tables and also sentence frames. And the beauty of these is that they can be pre-prepared, like with this resource, or you can just create them and draw them on the board as you're teaching. Okay, and in terms of increasing challenge, I think I'm running short of time, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I think there are lots of extension activities that are available to you with barrier games, but generally they involve extending the resource to maybe include writing tasks, or encouraging students to expand on the language they used, or of course they can also design their own barrier games as well. And I just want to show you this slide, which is a kind of summary of the different types of barrier game you might want to consider for different levels. So say the lower proficiency levels, listening and drawing or listening and arranging is going to be more appropriate. And at the higher levels, you can do things like listen and paraphrase or reformulate. So rather than just a single word information gap activity, we could use a whole paragraph, something like that. Okay, so just some final questions you might want to ask yourself when designing a barrier game activity, to see if it kind of is going to be useful and exploiting all the possible possibilities that barrier games can offer us. And here are some of the resources that I used when I was creating this webinar. They both come from sort of non-EAL context, actually, but I think barrier games are so powerful that they can be used they can be adapted very well for these EAL contexts. Okay, we are running a bit short, Shag. I'm I'm not sure we had many questions, but I'll hand it over to you.
Not at all, Tom. Well, thanks a lot for another information-packed webinar. It is. We've had our hour, but I haven't seen any questions. Although I see that 2 participants have raised their hands. So if you have a question, I will either allow you to talk if you would like to. If not, feel free to type your questions in the chat, and anyone else as well who might have any questions. If you do have to leave, thank you very much for joining us today. We will send a recording of the webinar in the next couple of days. If you've got a couple more minutes, let's see if there are any questions for Tom. Equally, if you have any questions following the webinar, feel free to email us and we'll get back to you with the answer as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of information there, but hopefully you were able to take something away. I think someone mentioned that it was good for sort of building on and kind of developing their existing ideas. And I think that's something that I definitely took out of doing this webinar as well, is that I've used a lot of these activities over the years so many times that I hadn't realized there were so many ways I could adapt and change them.
Lovely. Well, no questions for the moment, it seems. And just before everyone leaves, Tom, could you move the slide, please? Yeah. Just a reminder that we've got our online courses coming up as well. You can see the calendar here. There will be a couple more webinars before the end of the year as well that we will add to the calendar and we will advertise on the website. So if you haven't already, just feel free to sign up for our newsletter on our website if you would like to know about the webinars or the upcoming online courses that we're doing. As I said, we will email everyone the recording of the webinar with links to any of the key resources that Tom mentioned within the next couple of days. And you will also get a link to a feedback survey, which we would be very grateful if you could complete, just to help us see how useful the session was. So again, thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, thank you everyone. Goodbye and good luck with your barrier games.